One of the big components, as you have already mentioned, the hybrid war aspect of this escalation towards China. One of the things that is happening right now in all the headlines is this trade war. It has been restarted, but it never never really went away. But it's just in the headlines again with Trump threatening the 100% tariffs on China again, but now has backpedaled on that. And it's very confusing, I think, for the average person to even get their head around what is actually happening. Trump is kind of putting it again on China, like it came out of the blue. I don't know why Xi Jinping expanded export. He expanded some export regulations on rare earth related exports. It now requires an export license from the Ministry of Commerce. So, can you kind of break down what's actually happening here so that we can understand?
Yeah, there's a lot happening. First, I think it's important to know what's happening. It's not about fair trade, as a lot of them are claiming. It's about the US trying to maintain this global economic dominance in this increasingly multipolar world. And for many years, the US has maintained this hegemony that brought about massive suffering for people. And it's really quite absurd to accuse China of weaponizing trade when the US has weaponized economic dominance over Cuba, over Iran, over Venezuela. I saw a recent study from the Lancet that showed Western unilateral sanctions have caused, since 1970, anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million deaths per year. That is an incomprehensible level of violence that gets disguised as economic policy. Essentially, we get away with mass murder through the starvation, through limiting access to medicine and other life-giving resources. So we need to keep in mind that when Trump accuses China of weaponizing trade, it's one of the most massive hypocrisies and really an utter projection of Western policy abroad, because for decades it's been the US that's weaponized economic dominance through the dollar system, through sanctions, through control over supply chains. And so what we're seeing now is China really refusing to play by those old rules. And the new round of tariffs is essentially this. So on the surface, Trump, he's claiming that we're defending American interests against China's decision to implement export controls. And these controls don't mean that they're completely banning rare earth exports, right? It just means that you need to fill out the necessary paperwork so that the Ministry of Commerce has the final decision-making power. So it's still being exported, but just not for weapons. So it's not really China engaging in economic coercion, it's China asserting their own sovereignty over their own strategic resource, which is obviously something that every country has the right to do and that the US has done for a long, long time. But rare earth elements are important, especially for smartphones, electric vehicles, but also for advanced weapon system. And China currently refines a majority of the supplies of these materials. But China's export controls, by contrast to the United States, are mostly defensive. They're a way of saying, if you're going to restrict our access to the tech that we need to develop, we'll also protect our own strategic industries, which is fair enough, especially when the US is using these resources to build weapons that they want to use for a future war on China. It is at the root of it a very sensible security decision. And China, you wonder, why haven't they done this before? Well, it's because they now have the ability to do that because they aren't dependent on trade with the US. So that's really at the root of it. But another deeper issue here is that the US economic model is dependent on domination, right? And China presents a threat to that. So by building an independent industrial base, investing in innovation and trading with the global south, China is showing that development can happen outside of the mainstream orbit of Western institutions. So when we say this is a trade war, it's not really about trade, it's about control. And the tariffs are part of this policy of economic containment, which is a continuation of the overall strategy that began under Obama with the pivot to Asia and continued under Biden with the chips ban and tech sanctions. Both parties frame China as a threat, but what's actually under threat is US monopoly and the tools used, tariffs, the blacklists, the investment restrictions are all designed to slow China's development, particularly in high-tech sectors like AI and semiconductors and green energy. At the same time, economic warfare, it's tied to this wider information military campaign. And this narrative work is crucial because it manufactures consent for policies that would otherwise be recognized as acts of hostility. So when you combine this economic coercion, the tech blockades, and the military encirclement and disinformation, you get what we call this full-on hybrid war. So I think to truly understand the trade war, we really have to situate it in the broader picture of what's happening. The US is not responding to any unfair Chinese practices. It's reacting to the end of its own unchallenged dominance. And China's policies, including its export controls, represent the shift toward multipolarity as well as recognition that it must protect itself from the US using China's own strategic resources to prepare for war against it. And so, in that sense, what's happening is much larger than a dispute over tariffs. It's part of the global transition, and the hysteria in Washington reflects an inability to accept that change. So rather than adapting to a world where China and other nations have a bigger role, more of a voice in shaping global trade and tech standards, the US is trying to preserve its dominance through coercion and confrontation.